for me, growing up in a gender binary heterosexual area was very confusing for me just because I didn't know much options beyond those, and I always kind of felt that I didn't really fit in to any of those to those options to the heterosexual kind of guide that was given to me. And so for me, it made growing up a very difficult and kind of confusing time to try to figure out where exactly I lie, just because the one option I was given didn't really fit for me.
So how did you deal with that?
For me, I actually, growing up, I also came from a very religious family, so I was very much taught that you have male, you have female. They are the only ones who are allowed to have intimate emotional relationships with each other, and that you fall into one of those. You're one of those, and then you form a relationship in that. And for me, for a long time, I was actually confused upon my gender because of this, because I was told only women are allowed to be attracted to males, and males are supposed to be attracted to females. So by being attracted to other males, I felt for a long time that I didn't actually identify as male, that I must have been female because I don't fit this role. And then as I kind of grew older, my family unfortunately had to move away from the church, and that kind of allowed me to gain knowledge on other identities and other things, and slowly started to realize it's actually kind of sad. The first time I was introduced to the word gay was actually used on me as an insult.
Sure.
And then kind of did some research and was like, well, I understand this person was trying to mean this in a negative way, but that actually might be a very accurate term for me. And that's kind of how it came about for me, of realizing that it wasn't that I was necessarily female, which there was nothing wrong with identifying as female, but that it just wasn't the right fit for me. The right fit for me was actually being a gay male.
And then you came out when you were 18, you said?
So I kind of always knew that I was different from about the time that I was 5. I didn't actually publicly acknowledge that till I was about 16. I told a couple close friends and family members, but it wasn't until I was about 18, 19, starting college, and actually we moved up here to Chico and found a much more welcoming environment.
Right.
And that's when I started to be more public about my sexuality and my femininity as well.
So tell me again what pronouns you use.
I use he, him.
Okay. And Javi, you don't. You use different pronouns. What are yours?
All right. Well, hi, my name is Javi Pinedo. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm the advocacy coordinator over at Stonewall.
Tell people what Stonewall is in case they don't know, please.
Yeah, so Stonewall Alliance is a nonprofit organization that's out here in Chico that serves the LGBTQI plus community. North of Sacramento, there's not a lot of options. There's us, there's GSEC over at the campus, and then NorCal Outreach. And so a lot of folks don't know of those other resources or aren't a student, so can't access GSEC. And so a lot of people come and seek services over at Stonewall from various places of the North Valley. We get clients from Grass Valley, from Redding, from Gridley, from Quincy, and Colusa, Willows. We get folks from everywhere.
And why do you use those pronouns and not say he, him?
Well, he, him has never really fit me, and I think growing up, I was kind of always taught that I needed to fit within he, him, or she, her, that there's really only those two options and that I had to choose within the two. And so they, them actually was kind of a thing that I realized I liked a lot better when I was starting my work within LGBTQ nonprofit work. When there was a whole conversation around pronouns and using non-gender specific pronouns, I started using they, them as kind of a way to practice making sure that I don't gender other people and using pronouns for others. And shortly after I began using it for myself, I realized how much I really enjoyed it and how much it actually fit me a lot better and kind of just provided me a lot more openness and specificity, I guess is the word.
Growing up, how did you come to terms with shaping your own identity?
I never really thought I was anything other than what I currently am. Well, as somebody who is genderqueer and also queer, I never really thought I was anything else. didn't have the language then, but never really considered that I could be anything else. But I did know that at a very young age, at about 5 or 6 years old, I knew that I needed to be something else. I knew what I was, and I knew what I liked, and I knew how to kind of somewhat verbalize that for myself, but I also knew that I needed to be cisgender and heterosexual. I knew that my expectations were to like girls, to express myself very masculinely, and I knew that that was the expectation of me. So I kind of forced that upon myself very, very violently. And I remember having to tell myself, I need to get a girlfriend, and that's... And I remember my first girlfriend, and it was very awkward, never hugged her, never kissed her, never did anything, just kind of happened. And I remember telling myself that that's what I needed to do in order to cast these eyes off of me, in order to kind of blend in.
And what was your family's reaction?
So I was outed at the age of 13. And
by a friend or something?
By a family member.
A family member.
And so unfortunately, what happens a lot of the times for folks within the LGBTQI community is we're kind of all forced to know those horror stories, right? We've either seen them happen with friends or loved ones, or we've seen them in media, but we're all kind of like forced to know those horror stories. And so I didn't want to be it. So I left home once I was outed.
At 13?
At 13.
Oh, wow.
I left home. And once I was reconnected with my family, we had to have the conversation, and because we were chatting, and their first words to me were that they loved me and supported me no matter what, and that I didn't need to leave. But I remember the comments that immediately followed that were, as long as you don't become a woman. And that's always kind of been like that thing that kind of haunts me. Like, I could be queer and I could like people of different genders than what I'm supposed to like, but I just couldn't be a different gender.
Is that possible? Oh, I guess you could be trans.
I mean, you could be trans, you could be gender binary, non-binary, you can be agender, you could be demi-gender, you could be demi-boy, demi-girl, you could be really any gender you choose that suits best for you.
But they just didn't want you to identify as female.
Right, they wanted me to stick within the gender I was assigned.
Okay, good. Sarah, tell us about your growing up experience and what you're up to lately.
Hi, I am Dr. Sarah Cooper, and I'm the chair of the Multicultural and Gender Studies Department at Chico State.
Yay!
Yay, which Gayle Kimball, Dr. Kimball, was also professor there and chair of that department. I go by she, her, and I was born in 1964 in around the Dallas area in Texas, and so I never questioned the gender binary. I never questioned the incessant bombardment of images of the Southern male and the Southern female as being what there was. I fit in to a certain extent to that gender binary in that I had long hair, and I felt comfortable with long hair, and I felt comfortable with the toys that were presented to me. And I was not athletic and was not strong in those ways. I really wished I could have been more of a tomboy, but I just wasn't. I was a bookworm. And what I did get very, very confused about was the apparent heterosexuality as default and only option. That was confusing to me. It was 1964. It's not like I was knowing anything about the free love movement or the Kinsey Report. I knew nothing about any of that kind of thing. And all I knew was nobody ever talked about. I never saw any images of anything but men with women. And usually those images on television were still pretty asexual. You know, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore slept in different beds.
Right.
And but I would kiss the ladies in my daddy's magazines.
Oh.
And I was quite in love with my first best friend, and then pretty crushed out on my second best friend, and that was sort of a cycle for me. And but I dated guys, and I had crushes on guys too, and I knew that was okay to talk about, and the other was not okay to talk about, and yeah.
So where did that evolve to, like your first out relationship with a woman?
My first out relationship with a woman was kind of a partially out relationship, with my best friend in high school, who, while we were in high school, I had a boyfriend as well. And when I graduated from high school, I ran off, left that town fast, because I did not think that I could be a lesbian and deal with all of the social stigma. But as the next year or two unfolded, she and I did continue to have a faltering relationship, which my family did know about, and that then continued into out relationships with women, and then
This is college age we're talking about
college
now.
age. I mean, I failed out of college to start off with.
I love
it. And then I would also have relationships with men. And every time I had a relationship with a man, my mom thought that I had grown out of that phase. And then I would get into another relationship with a woman, and she would be confused. And and so since I got sober 26 years ago, I have not had any relationship with cisgender men.
And your first spouse was trans?
I got married to a woman, a butch dyke, who then a year or two later started realizing that actually he was a man, and who went into transition. And unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago. We had been separated and divorced, or the union had been dissolved. But yeah, that was my first marriage.
What did you notice, if anything, when he took testosterone? Any behavioral changes besides secondary sexual physiological changes?
Absolutely. One of the really kind of funny things was that he was just absolutely obsessed with his own physical changes. And I think that's pretty normal. When we are changing in puberty, we are obsessed with every single change. So here you're going through puberty again. And so he would sit and just stare at his arm, or stare at his face in the mirror, and look, and he'd point out the new hairs when they would come up. And the other thing was, he got so cranky and very self-absorbed about what his attention should be spent on. And I likened it to being in the house living with a teenage boy. I would literally ask him to put out the trash, because that was one of his self-identified jobs, and he would be pissed off. But I think that the other thing that was really important to notice was that he was just so relieved, really relieved. And in some ways, he was much more relaxed than I'd ever seen him before. even though, being trans and all is, comes with it a lot of stressors, and those stressors definitely applied, but also, especially in the tranquility of our home, he was very relaxed.
And are you in another marriage now?
I am. I'm in a wonderful, wonderful marriage with somebody who is sitting right here. We just bought and moved into a new home.
And who designed the new home?
Oh, just the interior.
Well,
We did
my
together.
spouse Sandra Beck really did the design for the remodel, although of course I have an opinion about most things.
Yeah, because she's an architect.
She's a client. That
I'm
has
a client?
opinions.
No, that makes sense. Right. Well, that's a good segue into you, Sandy. Tell
Sure.
us about growing up in a gender boxed world.
Well, I was born in 1957 and grew up in western Pennsylvania in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. At the time when I grew up, I felt very hemmed in by gender boxes, both by heterosexual relationships and by expectations around what I, as a young girl or woman, would be allowed to do versus what the guys could do. So, growing up in the 60s and 70s, there were definite limitations around proper behavior for, and who could stay out to a certain time. I remember having arguments with my parents that if my older brother, who was a year and a half older than me, could, when he turned 15, stay out to a certain time, that I should be able to do that too when I turned 15. And I had to fight every inch of the way. And I also remember telling my mom, that I was never going to get married. And that's because I had no interest in men. And she said, well, if you're not going to get married, you just have to find a good job and make enough money to take care of yourself.
That's practical.
That was very practical, and that was the first time my mom addressed it in a practicality way versus trying to convince me that really one day I would want to get married. Well, the fact is, when same-gender marriages were legalized in the U.S., I realized how much I wanted to get married. And I had realized before that I thought I did, but then all of a sudden, wow, this became even more important to me. So I would say from the gender boxes influenced me with regard to the heterosexual paradigm and with regard to being a woman. And add another layer on top of that, which is at the time I chose to study in what was predominantly a male field.
It still is.
Well, still is, but still is with regard to a glass ceiling and equity. However, more than 50% of the students attending architectural schools are women.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, it doesn't
Wow.
stop the men from holding on to the power at the top. And
Like all professions.
there's also a very strong equity by design program within the American Institute of Architects, our professional organization for equity for all cultures and genders.
How were women students treated in architecture school? Was it just like, oh, you're one of the boys?
It really depends on the person and the professor. I would say that when I went to architecture school, let's see, I was trying to think, there was 150 of us who started in our class, and about 10% of those were women. And 5 years later, about half of our class graduated, and about 10% of that were women. So the cuts and people who chose to leave were pretty much equitable from both genders. And it totally depended on who your professor was. There was definitely, in school and in the profession, I remember initially, for example, at my first job at a big firm, when I was asked to, when I was running off to the print room to run blueprints for my own project, and some of the guys would be like, oh yeah, can you run this for me and run that for me and run that for me? And I did it once and then realized, I don't see the other people doing it, I'm not going to do this. And I remember talking to my mom about it and saying, I'm just not going to do that. And she said, oh, Sandy, you have to be careful. Don't get yourself in trouble. And I said, how am I going to get in trouble? It's not my job to run blueprints for others. It's my job to do this. And she said, well, maybe you could just be nice and just help them. Well, that is kind of
Nasty
the opposite
women
of my
aren't
personality.
nice. Yeah.
Be nice and help them just doesn't fit me.
Well, that's this whole nasty women rebellion, resistance against Trump.
Yeah,
Being nice doesn't work.
Yeah, be nice is not, it's no fun. The pronouns I use to identify myself are she, her. However, the pronouns I will answer to are pretty much anything. I used to travel a lot for work and very easily pass sometimes as a man, and it's not through any intention of mine. I'm simply being myself, and if someone accords me the privilege of being called sir, then I take it. I'm not going to turn it down. 10 years ago, I would have corrected them. Now I feel like, nope, I'll take that male privilege and I'll use it for what I want.
Yeah.
And so that I would distinguish between what I identify as myself and the pronouns that I would answer to.
So is this your first marriage, or have you been married before?
It is my first marriage.
So you did
and
it.
my only.
Oh.
And I have to jump in and say that we really don't actually normally say same-sex marriage or similar gender marriage. We say marriage equality.
Okay.
But if we were to say one of those sayings, it would have to be more along the lines of similar gender, because we're not the same gender.
Yeah.
We may have been assigned the same biological sex at birth, but we're definitely not the same gender.
Yeah.
I'm a femme.
And I'm a butch, lesbian, dyke, whatever you want to call me. I call myself gender queer or gender nonconforming. I can use any of those terms. One of the things that I have to say was like a light bulb going off, big light bulb for me, was when Sarah and I first started going out many years ago, and she was talking to me about gender being on a continuum.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa,
That's Kinsey.
really? I mean, I'm 61. I gender on a continuum. I wish I would have known this way back when. I knew about Kinsey and sexuality being on a continuum, but I didn't understand about gender being on a continuum. And now I feel like that is so much more freedom. And good for kids growing up when they can be allowed to just express themselves as who they are, and they don't have to be pegged into one little box.
But don't you think that butch femme kind of dichotomy is pegging people? It used to kind of be in lesbian relationships that people kind of fit into one or the other, and there were
Well, that
roles.
was really more in 1950s working class.
And also a stereotype, I think.
Well, definitely, it's
Yeah.
definitely stereotypical, but certainly in the working class bars in certain metropolitan areas, like Chicago, Detroit, there's documentation of a lot of the communities expecting the butches and the femmes to act in certain ways, and take on certain roles inside and outside of the home.
Which just repeats the gender box.
But it
in
also
a
gave
certain
them
way.
freedom to participate in society as a couple, because many of the butches could pass and the femmes
That's also true.
were passing as women, which way they are and were, and it enabled them to participate in society. Those were the roles that existed, and those were the roles that people adopted.
But now it's changing.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
it's changing. Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting.
No, not at all. Because any one of us here at this table, regardless of how we feel inside about our gender, regardless of our appearance and our demeanor and our gestures and such, I think we're all pretty doggone clear at this table. None of that has any direct correspondence to our intellect, to our emotions, to our psychology, to our competencies.
Spirituality, anything like
Yeah.
that. I will say, I use the term butch dyke as a self-identifier because of two reasons. One is, number one, it's a badge of honor. And number two, those were the terms that I grew up with. I didn't know gender non-conforming. I didn't know those other terms. Now that there are other terms, I can call myself a butch dyke, or I can call myself a cisgender woman, but I rarely use that term. and I can talk about being gender nonconforming and so forth.
Radical feminists in the 70s wanted a society where there's nothing decided by our physiology. And so I'm thinking of books like The Dialectics of Sex by Shulamith Firestone and Marge Piercy's novel Woman on the Edge of Time. Those books were 1970, 1976, and nothing in those societies babies are made in machines outside of the uterus, so nothing is determined by our genitalia. So would someone like to address that? Would you like to have a culture where nothing is determined by your sex at birth? Or is that not an appealing view of society, a goal? Who wants to take that?
How about one of the young people at the table?
Well, I mean, personally for me, I like the idea of not assigning any kind of role based upon genitalia or sex. I feel that people should be given the choice to form their own identity. That I don't think that that's something that other people can tell you who you are. That's something you decide for yourself. And for me personally, that's been a struggle of my own. Is I've always wanted to listen to what other people say I'm supposed to be like. And then slowly realize that that's not how I'm going to be happy. I'm happiest when I get to decide for my own, and I think that that is a goal that we should strive for in society, in focusing on, being allowed to present ourselves in a way that makes us feel comfortable and makes us feel most at home, rather than, structuring our identity and our sexuality based upon our genitalia or how others perceive us to be.
So we have to distinguish between our sexuality and our gender. You want to take that one, Avi?
Well, I mean, I think kind of addressing the earlier question, I think the further we move away from the conversation of genitalia equaling gender and the way in which we're supposed to express ourselves, the better. Mm-hmm. I definitely think that we should allow new people into the world, allow them the option and the freedom of choice and expression, and presenting them with the options in the way in which it can look, right? And I think the more we move away from the conversation of a penis means this, a vagina means this, the better, right? Because it's gross and it's invasive. But I actually don't know what your second question is. What is your second question?
Would you like to see a society where nothing is determined by your XY or XX chromosomes?
I mean, yeah, definitely. Who wouldn't love to be in a society where their body, their anatomy, whatever, is not deciding everything for them? I definitely think that there should be options and role models, and that those have a place in sometimes in society, right? Where you can see folks who are experiencing something similarly to you and seeing them thrive and seeing them do amazing things. Like, there's value in that, right? But yeah, I don't think that there should be anything expected of any particular type of chromosomes or genitalia.
I agree. I was reading the link you sent over on a recent article. And
it was about how our brain is shaped in some ways by our male or female hormones.
I was really thinking about that with regard to biological versus my spirit.
Or our socialization.
Well, one could say socialization or culture impacts, but I guess I would say, so there's this biology thing that we're made up of cells and hormones and everything, and that has a certain level of influence or determines certain outcomes. And I'm with Javi and Matt, where I would prefer to not be predetermined by my biology if I had a choice in the world when I was a baby. And secondly, I think there's the who we are as a spiritual being, and in our soul, in our mind, whatever, and what feels right to us. I don't know where that comes from.
And we don't think of the soul as having a gender.
No, and we don't think of the soul as preferring one gender over another gender, or on a spectrum. We don't think of that, but where does it come from? I don't really believe that biology predetermines everything. I think, some people say, oh, well, it's culture, it's socialization. Well, maybe, but I was raised the same way as millions of other heterosexual kids who turned out to be heterosexual, and I didn't. So,
well, that's an argument for nature then, not nurture.
Yeah, I know. It just, what I'm saying is I don't think that it's a vacuum, that it's one or the other. You don't flip a switch. I think that we are born as human beings in a very magical way with magical stuff inside us that I think allows us choices and ways to develop on our own.
And that's breaking another one of the dichotomies, right? It's not just nature or nurture.
It's both.
Well, it's also other elements, like spirit.
I think so.
Right, and then also the human body and the human experience is so different for everybody. And for some people, it's totally all about nature, and it's totally about the way in which their body is telling them, and that's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but also acknowledging that, it can also be different. I did read that article, and I think one of the hardest things I had with that article was that there was this constant throughout the entire article, this constant labeling as this hormone, this chromosome being male, this hormone being female, and then this constant labeling of genitalia as male genitalia, as female genitalia, when in actuality what you're talking about is you're talking about a penis, you're talking about a vagina, you're talking about estrogen, you're talking about testosterone, and none of those actually equal what the article is saying that it equals. For some people it does, and that's great, and that's beautiful. More power to you. But for a lot of folks, it doesn't. And I mean, even for me, the presence of whatever genitalia I have does not mean my gender. My gender is not male. The pronouns I use is not he, him, his. And none of that was decided by nature. All of that was decided by me because of who I am. But also it's on a spectrum. And if you would have been asking me this at the age of 13 and 14, I might have told you a completely separate answer. Simply because of the knowledge of the words I had at the time, and also what I knew to be gender, right? And at that age, I was totally cis. I was totally a young cis gay boy because that's what I knew and that's what I loved. And I'm not going to take that away from 14-year-old me, from 13-year-old me. But I can say that my gender has changed, that it is fluid, and it might change again. It's all fluid.
If I could just add another element into this interesting stew we're making. Biological sex is not an either or, it is another spectrum, it's another continuum.
Because there's intersex and hermaphrodites. And
there, the primary and secondary sex characteristics vary widely. Absolutely what? I mean, just really the arbitrary nature of the determination of what a baby is supposed to be in terms of biological sex that's going to be assigned is ludicrous. Like, if it's less than an inch, if it's more than an inch, and then and so if there's that minute of a difference,
like hermaphrodite or intersex,
like somebody who's intersex, yes.
I wouldn't even use those labels.
Yeah.
Because I think that puts, again, people in certain boxes.
The truth is that male and female is another false dichotomy. That's all there is to it.
And then go ahead.
I was just going to ask if we could stray away from the word hermaphrodite, just because in a lot of communities it's actually a very offensive term. Intersex is totally fine. That's a term that a lot of people use to define that. But hermaphrodite, especially for me, I like to stray away from it just because I know individuals who do identify as intersex, and hermaphrodite is often used as a very derogatory term towards them, and it has a lot of negativity
What
towards
does it imply as opposed to intersex?
Well, so the reality of intersex is that intersex is a spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. There's a set of primary and secondary characteristics, and they don't all look the same. It can be that very visual a genitalia difference, or it can be later on in life during puberty and which organs become functioning, where the body fat begins to distribute, where the body hair grows. It could also be chromosomally. There's such a variant degree of what intersex can look like, that hermaphrodite, yes, was used very derogatorily in the past and typically meant one option of that genitalia difference,
And you
right?
have to choose if you're going to make this baby male or female, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, but then the funny thing with it is, and what I always do in the trainings that I provide over at Stonewall is, well, I'll let people know that yes, hermaphrodite in the past has been used very derogatorily, and for the most part people use the word intersex. But the reality of it is that I can't police that word, right? If somebody who does fall within the intersex spectrum chooses to identify with the word hermaphrodite, I'm not going to tell them no, right? That's not within my power. However, what I can say is for allies, for folks who are not a part of that, the accepted word is, yes, intersex. The word that folks are choosing to identify themselves with is intersex, because it allows that spectrum.
And
You know what-
hermaphrodite is also, it's a diagnosis, and it's an indication of your place on a social stratum.
What I think is interesting about the whole genetic question is epigenetics. Do you know about that? So epigenetics is saying that how our genes express is evoked by our environment. So our genetic expression can change, which is kind of the theme that we've been talking about today in terms of multiple options and varieties and variations and
I just have
flexibility.
to say one thing, and that is, I'm really a neophyte around science, but do we not hear that when your genes change, they can become cancerous, and that can be caused by the environment? I mean, to me, calling one thing epigenetics versus something else that, I've had friends pass away from cancer that were purely environmental caused. I don't know. The science area, as I said, I'm not a scientist. It gets very deep and very muddy for me. I don't think it's easy to label one thing, to use a label to identify any one area of thought. Just me, Gayle.
No, that's fine. Let's talk about terms, because listeners may not be familiar with this. So what is cisgender? We've talked about that.
So cisgender, it's kind of like the opposite of trans. So like trans is somebody who does not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Meaning at birth, the parents, the doctor, the person who birthed them stared at their genitalia and decided that this genitalia meant this gender, right? That's what trans is, somebody who does not identify with that marker. Cisgender is somebody who does identify with it.
Right. And what I think is interesting about non-binary gender is some countries and some states recognize a third sex. Canada, Germany, Austria, India, Oregon, and California. So someone define for us non-binary gender.
That's a fun one. So non-binary, and please, if anybody else wants to chime in, non-binary is somebody who is outside of the binary concepts of male or female, or sometimes a mixture of it. Non-binary is just basically outside of the idea that that there is the two genders and that you have to be within the two.
So is it fair to say everybody here is in a non-binary kind of approach?
Only if they choose
No.
to identify
No.
that way.
Yeah. So, like personally myself, I identify as male. So I do still identify within that,
So you're
that binary.
you're cis male.
Yes, I would say that I would be, I consider myself cisgender. I was assigned male at birth. I still identify as male. But that doesn't mean that rule applies to everybody else. There are many other options, and I think non-binary is often used just kind of as an umbrella term for male and female don't fit me. There's some part of me that doesn't feel I align perfectly with that gender, and I think that a lot of people kind of use the excuse of genitalia to fall in that, and that's more in the category of sex rather than the category of gender.
Sarah, you wanted to?
Yeah,
If I
sure.
could.
So intellectually and theoretically, I know absolutely that the gender binary is false, that dichotomy does not exist. However, I find it very difficult to conceptualize myself other than female, because it was easy for me. It was super easy. And so even though I know that that's a label that really is not supported by good science, it's one of the few easy ways I fit into society.
It's convenient.
It's convenient, and I resist and rebel in so many other ways that I couldn't say that for myself that I identify as non-binary. What I identify is sometimes I'm gender non-conforming, I'm queer, I absolutely refuse to adhere to your expectations when they don't fit with my own desires and expectations, that kind of thing.
Got it. So what about cultures that have a third sex, like Berdache in some Native American tribes? It's often men who act in the function of women, or the Hijra, however you say it in India. I've danced with them, that are men who dress like women and take on women's roles, and they're accepted. This is a third sex. Do you think that's a productive way of looking at things?
Are you referring to sex or gender?
Gender.
Gender,
Okay.
definitely.
Thank you.
So there's definitely been plenty of different cultures.
But they call it third sex.
There's when we look at the past, we see that most other cultures had different versions of gender, and it wasn't really until the spread of Christianity and the spread of colonialism that kind of forced this idea of two genders. And even within the United States, the way in which we view gender is actually a fairly new and recent concept. But there are plenty of other genders that are out there. There's many different relationships with gender. Only you can really decide what gender means for you or what your gender is. And a bunch of other folks in different cultures have their own definitions of what this gender means or what this gender can look like. And yeah, sometimes it's a third gender, sometimes it's a fifth gender, sixth gender, or many, many more. There's a lot of beautiful cultures that are out there. And one thing that I do always run across when discussing these other genders that other cultures have is a lot of the times folks want to take on the term two-spirit because it's a term that they're kind of familiar with. And what we always want to address is the fact that that is a native and indigenous term. That is a term that comes from the culture of these people. And to
it
really
refers to gay men mainly, right? Queer
no,
men?
it can refer to anybody who fits within that description that is also native and indigenous. And I always tell people to kind of do your own research within your own culture. There's a lot of different versions of gender that are in our own personal cultures. I was talking to a person the other day about looking into their own Celtic, I don't know how to pronounce it, looking into their own culture, because there were some that existed prior to the spread of Christianity. And to really look into it, because those words can be beautiful and should be shared.
I just want to comment one thing, and that is that I like the term non-binary. And Matt, thank you for the good description of it. I feel like in many ways that fits me. You know, it gives me an out. I don't have to be one. I don't have to be the other. Because I don't feel I'm totally a woman. And I know I'm not totally a man. And I don't have a desire to transition. So I think the non-binary is a great description. Also, when we talk about countries or cultures having a third sex, again, interchanging terms sometimes feels a little shaky, a little dicey, but I like the whole idea of gender non-binary as the third choice, because a lot of people say they're male, a lot of people say they're female, and then there's a lot of us that don't identify with any one of those.
I think androgyny is an interesting word, and Sandra Bem did a sex role inventory, she called it. That's classic. It's been around for a long time. And she tested people, and you could test androgynous, masculine, feminine, or undifferentiated. And undifferentiated meant you scored low on both masculine and feminine qualities. And what she found is the androgynous scoring people were the most creative, the most successful, the happiest. So her point is that it's nice to be able to flexibly draw from the so-called stereotype characteristics of both genders and use whatever works. If you need to be with kid, be nurturing. If you need to ask your boss for a raise, be instrumental. Any comments on androgyny?
I think for me, androgyny first came up as a concept in science fiction, or that I was introduced to in science
Right.
fiction, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And then in college, I had a girlfriend who identified as androgynous, and she started trying to kind of bring it into the plane of reality for me. And I find that it is a very, very strong and powerful way of rejecting the box and taking up everything. Like yes, I am that, and yes, I am that, and I am that, and I am that, and I am that. I am all of it. I think that when we're more focused on the positive and embracing everything that's within us, rather than worrying about limiting or no, I'm not. I think it's just a more joyful way of life.
Absolutely. Let me take a little break here and thank our sponsors. Also, I want to let listeners know that a videotape of our talk tonight and previous shows are available on my YouTube channel, and it's called, you just Google YouTube Gayle Kimball or Global Youth, and you'll see a copy of this video. So we want to thank generous contributions of KZFR supporters and by the law firm of Peters, Habib, McKenna, Jewel Rhodes, and Cardoza, LLP. They specialize in civil litigation and criminal defense with an emphasis in personal injury and real estate litigation. Serving the community for over 100 years. Whoa, those are old lawyers. The law firm of Peters, Habib, McKenna, Jewel Rhodes and Cardoza, LLP, is located at 414 Salem Street in downtown Chico. Their telephone number is 530-342-3593. And Ask Dr. Gayle is made possible by Baker's Birkenstock, featuring more than 40 brands of footwear, socks, purses, and hats. Baker's Birkenstock has been serving our community for over 40 years with locations at 331 Broadway Street in downtown Chico and at 5781 Clark Road in Paradise. So just a reminder that you're listening to FM radio 90.1, listener-supported community radio for the Sacramento Valley, foothills, and beyond. And the views expressed on our show don't necessarily represent the views of the station or the sponsors. So I want to switch a little bit to talking about feminism from a different angle. And it seems like there's always a group that feels left out, and there's some kind of and the latest is trans women. And so there's been critique in the feminist academic situation that trans women aren't treated with the same kind of respect or whatever. So maybe, Sarah, you could address that, the trans women in academia, women's studies, feminism.
Sure, absolutely. I just wish that my brand new colleague, Claudia Sofia Garriga Lopez, was here because her main focus is on trans feminism.
Is she trans?
She is not trans. So always we are in a very hierarchical society, and we're grasping for power, and once we have any tiny little shred of power, then we're afraid to share that power or to let that power go. And trans women, or any kind of disruption of the gender binary, then can feel very, very threatening to women who have been in a lifelong fight to try to get rights for women. And certainly we can say that equality, just on the basis even of the gender binary, has not been achieved. And in early days, feminists were really afraid to allow trans women to be a part of their agenda, to be even a part of their organizations.
Because they're like really suspect disguised men or something?
Oh, I think certainly that some women, some feminists thought that. And others just thought, oh, no, we won't be taken seriously if we allow these other people to share the stage with us. And some feminists just didn't even want to admit at all that somebody could not have been socialized male since birth and then be given privilege and then
Give it up.
give it up fully and be part of the woman's experience. They found it hard to have that understanding and compassion that trans women are going to face twice the oppression just from a different angle. What I see happening now in academic circles with this trans feminism is fascinating. It's going into analyzing a situation by asking whether the most the person who is most an outsider, the person who is most othered, the person who least fits in to the structure of socioeconomic power, asking if that person is faring well or faring poorly. And that should be the basis for action. It shouldn't be, well, are women being treated well? Okay, well, which women? White women, women of color. It shouldn't be, are people of color being treated well? Well, because, not all people of color are the same by any means. Now, you find the trans woman of color, sex worker, homeless, on the streets, perhaps even drug addicted or in a developing nation, maybe also is trying to take care of a family. And you ask, is that person being served? If that person is not being served, then we need to take action. And a feminism that is based on making sure that the least of us has the same as the most of us is a feminism that is appropriate for this day and age.
What do you hear, because there's a trans group, Javi, at Stonewall, what do you hear from them in terms of their issues, what they're working through at this point in their transition?
That's a really complex question. I did want to address though the use of the language of lately. I think it's really important to acknowledge that trans folks didn't just kind of pop up and exist randomly, right? That we've existed for a very long time and have always kind of been here. And a lot of feminist movements have historically, for a very long time, excluded trans voices in particular. When we look at instances like the Human Rights Campaign, the HRC, when they were trying to pass the first round of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, they specifically told trans organizations that they were going to take the part around gender identity out because they needed to get the part around sexual orientation in. And they needed to get they needed to get what they needed passed. That is a very clear picture of how we have failed trans folks and how we have constantly tried to privilege ourselves over trans folks because there's this idea that there's a limit of resources, right? That if we can at least get there, then maybe we can come back for them later. But how many people have we lost along that process?
And that's what happens in every revolution. We'll pick up the women after we complete the revolution, and it doesn't happen.
Right. Yeah. So definitely acknowledging that, just being a little bit cautious around our language around timeline and that no, trans people didn't just kind of pop up in the 60s, right? It's been a thing that's always kind of existed.
It's the concept and the language that's popped up in the last half century.
Right, it's become popularized, or at least it's available easily. And part of that is internet, right? The internet has brought opportunities for people to have communications across the world and easily, at the at the touch of a finger. It's super easy to get information now. So yeah, that's definitely played its role in it. But a lot of these words, a lot of these identities have always existed. It just maybe the words were slightly different, or they just didn't have the opportunity to speak or have their experiences listened to.
To kind of switch a bit, what about men's studies? I don't think there's any men's studies classes at Chico State, and some people in the men's movement argue about the hazards of being male, a real classic book by Herb Goldberg, that the male role is really harmful to men, they die 7 years younger than women, and that we need to do more to support men, cis men, to break out of their hazardous roles.
Well, there is no generic course on masculinity at Chico State. There are two different things. There are many courses on gender that do address issues of masculinity and the gender spectrum and socialization into limited roles. And also, there are new sections over the last, I think, 3 years of a leadership studies course that focus specifically on men of color. And we're working on one of women of color, but what has been missing is that specific study and including self-study of what it is to be a man for those people who identify as men, and how do they do that in this day and age and be true to themselves.
Yeah, I was just going to say specifically, I actually had the pleasure of taking one of these courses. I was actually a TA for for Dr. Bauer, Dr. Janelle Bauer.
What was the course?
It was called Men, Women, and Media, which I think is kind of an outdated name for it, because we did talk a lot about those who identify outside of the binary. But we did talk a lot about men's movements, and mainly just how there is kind of there's still just huge emphasis on toxic masculinity and how men have to behave in one certain way, and how you can still identify as male and not follow that strict kind of stereotype of the toxic masculinity of you have to be in this certain way, you have to present yourself in this certain way, you have to like these certain things. It's still possible to be to consider yourself a male and to identify in that way without following these strict kind of guidelines.
Were there very many men in that class?
Oh yes, there were very many individuals who identified as male.
Cis
Yeah, there are very many individuals who identified as male and who took a lot from the class, and I really enjoyed. It was one of the few classes where they always ask you at the beginning of classes, what do you think about the subject matter, and then reflect on it at the end. And I was greatly given the privilege of being the TA for that class and getting to see exactly what these individuals thought about gender and about masculinity and femininity at the beginning, and then seeing how much that their mind had been opened up and how much they've kind of grown and accepted all of these different, a lot of them came in going, there's male, there's female, that's it. And then a lot of them came going, there are so many things, I don't have enough room on this paper to list all of them. And I think that's really great that we offer that kind of class and those kinds of opportunities for people to expand their knowledge and really see that there isn't just these, two very, very confined roles.
Right. Stay tuned for Peanut Butter and Jelly Time with Sandra. She's in the studio now and putting in her tape. I want to thank the panel so much, Matt and Javi and Sandy and Sarah. Any last word in a few seconds to anything else you want to leave us with?
I'm so glad that we have leaders like Matt and Javi to take us into the next generation.
Last couple words that I would like to say is, for those who are listening, my name is Javi, not Javier, not Jose, not anything else. My name is Javi. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. Chico Pride is coming up Please attend. There's wonderful opportunities to be involved. There's Queer Justice is Racial Justice, which I'm a part of throwing, which will be an event which is intended for queer and trans people of color and community. There's our Pride Dance. There's the festival that's happening. There's the teen dance. There's our comedy show.
There's the comedy show. There's a
When is
brunch.
this?
This is happening August 23rd through 26th.
Where?
That's here in Chico. We are the only Pride in Northern California that I know of that is 4 days long. Actually, personally, we're the only one that I know of anywhere that is 4 days long.
Is there a website if people can find out?
www.stonewallchicopride.com. You can find out all the information on there. And you could also check us out for more information on each of the individual events, just Chico Pride.